Welcome to this lecture on trauma studies, a field where literature, psychology, history, and culture intersect to help us understand how persons, communities, and texts respond to experiences that defy ordinary representation. Today's session introduces you to the origins and intellectual foundations of trauma studies, its objectives and scholarly significance, some key authors and literary texts, and finishes with a focused analysis of one exemplary work. Finally, we will point to emerging directions in this field. Let's begin. What is trauma studies? Trauma studies is an interdisciplinary area of inquiry that explores how psychological trauma is experienced, embodied, remembered, forgotten, narrated, resisted, or silenced in individuals and cultures, particularly as reflected in literature and other narratives. At its core, the field asks, how does extreme experience disrupt memory and language? In what ways do texts represent experiences that seem unspeakable? What ethical responsibilities do writers, readers, and scholars have toward traumatic pasts? This is not just about pain, it is about representation, survival, testimony, identity, and history. Let's focus on the origin and intellectual lineage. Trauma studies emerged in the late 20th century, shaped foremost by psychoanalytic theory and especially the work of Sigmund Freud. Freud's studies on hysteria and later beyond the pleasure principle introduced ideas such as deferred action. The experience of trauma often returns and is understood belatedly rather than at the moment of occurrence. Next, dissociation and repetition. Trauma fragments consciousness and returns through dreams, flashbacks, or compulsive repetition. In parallel, clinical recognition of trauma, particularly through post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) in the DSM in the 1980s, helped shape cultural and academic awareness of trauma as both a psychological and social phenomenon. By the 1990s, literary critics began theorizing trauma as a narrative problem. How do we write what resists narrative? How do stories encounter that which is beyond ordinary language? Let's focus on the objectives of trauma studies. At a scholarly level, trauma studies aims to analyze narratives forms that represent trauma, including fragmentation, silence, repetition, and paradox. Number 2. Explore memory and forgetting. How recollections shape identities and how memory is culturally mediated. Number 3. Investigate ethical dimensions. How narratives bear witness to suffering and how readers responsibly receive them. Number 4. Deconstruct historical and cultural trauma. Examining cultural trauma such as war, genocide, slavery, colonialism, and systematic violence. Thus, this field is both theoretical and applied. It theorizes trauma and then applies those concepts to text, histories, and cultural practices. Let's focus on the prominent theorist and text. The key theorist of this theory is Sigmund Freud, who is the foundational psychoanalytic insights on trauma, memory, and repression. Next is Kathy Caruth, pivotal figure in literary trauma theory, emphasizes the belatedness of traumatic memory and the paradox of knowing and unknowing. Anne Chekovich expands trauma into affective public cultures. Last, Greg Forter offers a pluralistic approach differentiating punctual and non-punctual trauma, embedding trauma in social and historical context. Some literary texts representing trauma studies are often applied to novels, memoirs, and graphic narratives such as Art Spiegelman's Moss, which is a Holocaust and intergenerational trauma, Elie Wiesel's Night, representing Holocaust testimony, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, and finally the exemplary work Toni Morrison's Beloved. Each of these texts illustrates distinctive ways trauma is narrated, remembered, or represented. Now let's focus detailedly about Toni Morrison's Beloved. To exemplify trauma studies in practice, let's turn to Toni Morrison's Beloved, a novel that has become central in trauma scholarship because of how it confronts the legacy of slavery. Why Beloved matters to trauma studies. Beloved is not just historical fiction, it dramatizes how afterlives of trauma shape identity and community. Its narrative strategies, fragmented chronology, multiplicity of voices, and scenes of haunting all mimic the psychological dynamics of trauma. Key aspects of trauma representation in Beloved. Number one, fragmentation. The story moves past and present, refusing a linear chronology. This fragmentation reflects the way traumatic memory surfaces in the mind in pieces, flashes, and repetitions rather than coherent continuity. Number two, haunting as return of the repressed. The character Beloved functions both literally and symbolically as the embodiment of repressed traumatic experience. She returns to demand recognition and reconciliation with a painful past that the community had tried to bury. Number three, memory and speech. Many characters experience speechlessness or difficulty articulating their past. Morrison uses gaps, pauses, and indirect narration to convey how language itself can be strained in the face of extreme pain, a central concern in trauma studies. Number four, collective trauma. Beloved does not isolate trauma in individuals alone. It situates trauma within social history, slavery, community, survival, and the ongoing legacy embedded in the body, in relationships, and in cultural memory. When Morrison's character confront their past, they do not simply remember, they renegotiate meaning. This is why Beloved is central to trauma studies. It connects individual psychological experience with historical and cultural memory. That's fine. Where this trauma studies heading towards? Over the past 2 decades, trauma studies has expanded in several exciting directions. Number one, pluralistic models. Rather than treating trauma solely as unrepresented or pathological, scholars now emphasize diverse cultural context, trauma in everyday life, and social, political, and institutional sources of trauma, and also in active memory as reconstruction rather than absence. Number two, intersectional trauma. Current research integrates race, gender, sexuality, and class, examining how systems of power produce experiences of trauma differently across social groups. Number three, new media and digital narratives. Trauma studies increasingly engage with forms beyond the novel: film, graphic narratives, digital storytelling, and social media, emphasizing how trauma is mediated in the digital age. Number four, ethical listening and witnessing. Scholars now emphasize not just how trauma is represented, but how audiences receive and respond to it. Ethical witnessing becomes part of scholarly responsibility. Let's conclude. Trauma studies is both a lens and a practice. It invites us to think deeply about how humans make sense of what resists sense, how memory, history, language, and identity are shaped by events that exceed conventional narratives. From Freud's insight on deferred memory to Morrison's haunting prose, trauma studies remain a vibrant site of inquiry, one that demands both intellectual rigor and ethical engagement. Thank you for watching this introduction to trauma studies. In future sessions, we will explore case studies, methodological tools, and critical applications across disciplines.